The morning of March 10th, 1945, Imperial Japanese Army Headquarters, Tokyo. Colonel Masataka Ida sat motionless at his desk, telephone receiver pressed against his ear as dawn light filtered through smoke-darkened windows. The voice on the other end belonged to a police superintendent whose district no longer existed. For 12 minutes, Ida listened in silence as the man recounted impossible numbers. 100,000, perhaps more. Ida had served in China. He had witnessed the siege of Nanking. He had seen what modern warfare did to cities and civilian populations. But nothing in his experience, nothing in Japan's entire military history, had prepared him for what lay across Tokyo this morning. 16 square miles of the capital reduced to ash in a single night. 750,000 people had lived in those districts yesterday. Today, more than 1 in 10 were dead. Through his office window, Ida could see smoke rising from the eastern wards, massive columns that merged into a single dark curtain obscuring the sunrise. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American B-29 bombers had done this, 279 of them, flying so low their engines had shaken buildings across the city. They had dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs filled with napalm on the most densely populated urban area on Earth. Ida set down the telephone. His hand, trained to remain steady under artillery fire, trembled slightly. The colonel understood what many of his colleagues would spend the coming months refusing to accept. Japan could not win this war. The nation that had attacked Pearl Harbor, believing American industrial power to be exaggerated, the military command that had gambled on quick victory before American production reached full capacity, had just witnessed the opening act of a campaign that would prove every optimistic assumption catastrophically wrong. The Americans had demonstrated something far more devastating than superior numbers or better technology. They had revealed an industrial and logistical capacity to systematically destroy Japan's cities, one by one, with a regularity and thoroughness that no defense could prevent. The gap between what Japan could produce and what America could deploy had become a chasm so wide that continuing the war meant national suicide. Yet Ida knew he could not speak these thoughts aloud, not in March of 1945, with the military government still committed to fighting until extinction. The colonel would have to watch, day by day, as the evidence mounted, as more cities burned. As the psychological collapse he felt this morning spread through the Japanese leadership like a slow-acting poison, until even the most fanatical could no longer deny what Colonel Ida understood in his bones on the morning of March 10th. America's true power had finally revealed itself, and Japan stood helpless before it. The path to this moment of horrifying clarity had been paved with years of systematic miscalculation. Japan's war planners had never intended to match American industrial output. They couldn't. In 1941, Japan's industrial capacity represented approximately 3% of America's manufacturing power. This disparity was known, documented, discussed in policy meetings, yet Japanese strategy had proceeded anyway, built on a foundation of assumptions about American character and resolve that would prove disastrously wrong. The gamble was elegant in its desperation. Strike Pearl Harbor, seize Southeast Asia's resources, establish a defensive perimeter so vast and fortified that America would negotiate rather than pay the cost of reconquest. The plan assumed Americans were soft, divided, unwilling to endure the casualties required for total war. It assumed wrong. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had warned his government. Before Pearl Harbor, he had written that Japan could put up a tough fight for 6 months, but had no confidence if the war extended to 2 or 3 years. Yamamoto had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington, traveled extensively across the continental United States. He had walked through automobile factories in Detroit and witnessed production lines churning out vehicles at rates Japanese manufacturing could barely comprehend. But Yamamoto's warnings had been politically inconvenient. The decision for war came from army leaders who had never seen American factories, who believed Japanese fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, who convinced themselves that the statistics about American production must be exaggerated. Reality would prove them wrong in the most brutal manner possible. The first 18 months of war had reinforced Japanese confidence. The speed of conquest was breathtaking. The Philippines fell. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered. The Dutch East Indies and their precious oil fields came under Japanese control. By March of 1942, Japan commanded an empire stretching from the Chinese interior to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the approaches of Australia. These victories created dangerous overconfidence. The ease with which Japanese forces had defeated Western colonial powers led many in Imperial General Headquarters to believe that American industrial might have been vastly overstated. If the British Empire could be humbled, if American forces in the Philippines could be overwhelmed, perhaps the Pacific War was proceeding even better than hoped. Warning signs appeared for those willing to see them. The Doolittle raid in April of 1942, though tactically insignificant, demonstrated American determination and technical capability. 16B, 25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier struck Tokyo and other cities, causing minimal physical damage but profound psychological impact. Japan's sacred homeland had been violated. The myth of invulnerability had been shattered. Then came Midway in June of 1942. The battle that destroyed Japanese naval supremacy exposed fatal flaws in strategic planning. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 3,000 men, and critically, approximately 100 trained pilots, plus hundreds of irreplaceable aviation mechanics and technicians. American losses were lighter: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 307 men. The critical question was production capacity. Japan entered the war with 6 large fleet carriers and 5 smaller ones. America had 3 large carriers in the Pacific at war's start. The difference lay not in initial strength, but in industrial replacement capacity. In the 3 years following Midway, Japanese shipyards constructed 6 aircraft carriers. American shipyards delivered 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and dozens of escort carriers. The Essex-class carriers themselves represented an industrial achievement Japanese planners could barely comprehend. The United States Navy initially ordered 32 Essex-class carriers. 24 were built. 14 saw combat service before war's end. Each displaced 30,000 tons, measured 870 feet in length, and carried more than 90 aircraft. At peak production, American shipyards were launching 1 Essex-class carrier approximately every 6 weeks. The numbers extended across every category of military production. American factories built 86,000 tanks compared to Japan's approximately 2,000 medium and heavy tanks. America produced 2 million trucks. Japan managed approximately 165,000. In aircraft, the disparity was equally stark. In 1944 alone, American factories produced more planes than Japan built during the entire war. From 1939 to 1945, America produced approximately 297,000 aircraft. Japan produced approximately 76,000. Japanese military planners had access to much of this information through intelligence reports, neutral country sources, and simple observation of equipment appearing in combat. Yet the numbers created cognitive dissonance that prevented proper strategic adjustment. The figures were so overwhelming that accepting them meant accepting inevitable defeat. Japanese commanders chose instead to hope that the numbers were exaggerated, that American quality would prove inferior to Japanese fighting spirit, that somehow the tide could be turned through tactical brilliance and self-sacrifice. This denial persisted even as material evidence accumulated. At Guadalcanal, from August of 1942 through February of 1943, American forces demonstrated their ability to sustain combat operations across vast oceanic distances. The campaign became a grinding attritional struggle that exposed Japan's critical vulnerability in logistics, supply, and replacement capacity. The Japanese merchant fleet, essential for supplying far-flung garrisons, steadily eroded under American submarine attack. Japanese merchant ship production never matched losses. In 1943, American submarines sank more Japanese tonnage than Japanese shipyards launched. By 1944, Japan's merchant marine was in terminal decline, unable to supply captured territories or transport resources back to the home islands. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, the resource Japan had gone to war to secure, increasingly remained undelivered as tankers fell victim to American torpedoes. The raw materials of empire, iron ore from Malaya, rubber from Indochina, rice from Burma, piled up uselessly in ports while Japanese factories ran short and the home islands faced starvation. Aircraft production illustrated similar patterns. While American factories churned out newer, better designs in massive quantities, Japanese production stagnated in both numbers and technology. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, brilliant when introduced in 1940, remained in frontline service throughout the war with only minor modifications. American fighters progressed from the adequate F-4F Wildcat to the superior F-6F Hellcat to the exceptional F-4U Corsair, each iteration outperforming its predecessor. By 1943, American fighters were demonstrably better than Japanese designs, and they appeared in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese air units. The pilot training differential compounded these advantages. America's vast educational infrastructure supported massive pilot training programs. Aviation cadets received thorough instruction in multi-engine aircraft, navigation, tactics, and gunnery. The pipeline of new pilots grew throughout the war. Japan's training programs, resource-constrained and casualty-depleted, shortened training periods and reduced standards. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with a fraction of the flight hours their American counterparts received. Superior American aircraft flown by better-trained pilots produced predictable results. Japanese aircrew losses became unsustainable. The fall of the Mariana Islands in summer of 1944 marked the moment when the Japanese High Command could no longer maintain illusions about the war's trajectory. The invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944. American forces, supported by massive naval gunfire and abundant supplies, steadily overwhelmed Japanese defenders. The fighting was savage, with Japanese soldiers and civilians choosing death over capture, but the outcome was never in doubt. Saipan fell on July 9th, Tinian followed on August 1st. Guam was secured by August 10th. The strategic implications were severe. The Marianas placed American B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The carefully constructed defensive perimeter had been penetrated. Japan itself, now, faced direct strategic bombing. Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo, who had pushed Japan into war, was forced to resign on July 18th, having lost political support. His successor, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited an impossible situation. The war was effectively lost, but surrender remained politically and militarily unthinkable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th to 20th, concurrent with the Marianas invasion, provided another demonstration of American material supremacy. Japanese naval aviation attempting to attack American carriers was slaughtered in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days of air combat, Japan lost approximately 480 aircraft and 3 carriers. American losses were comparatively light. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. Emperor Hirohito, traditionally remaining above political and military decisions, became increasingly concerned as the true situation became clear. The emperor was regularly briefed on the war's progress. By early 1945, he understood that Japan faced certain defeat. Yet the emperor's constitutional position and the political strength of the army prevented him from directly ordering surrender. The strategic bombing of Japan began in earnest in November of 1944, when the first B-29 seconds struck from the newly captured Marianas bases. These initial raids employed high-altitude precision bombing tactics similar to those used against Germany. The results were disappointing. Strong jet stream winds at 30,000 feet blew bombs off target. Cloud cover obscured aim points. Mechanical problems plagued the complex new aircraft. Japanese industrial production continued. The American command recognized that a change in strategy was necessary. In January of 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of XXI Bomber Command in the Marianas. LeMay was a hard, pragmatic officer who had learned strategic bombing over Germany. He understood that destroying Japan's war production required different tactics than those employed in Europe. LeMay's analysis of Japanese vulnerability was coldly logical. Over 50% of Tokyo's industry was spread among residential and commercial neighborhoods in small cottage workshops that produced components for larger factories. These workshops were housed in wooden structures built closely together in the most densely populated urban districts on Earth. The buildings were highly flammable, designed for a climate that feared heat more than fire. Tokyo had only 18 concrete air raid shelters, each holding 5,000 people, providing shelter for 90,000 citizens out of a population of 4.3 million. 98% of Tokyo's buildings were constructed of wood and paper. The city's fire department possessed 8,000 firefighters equipped with 1,000 pieces of equipment and exactly 3 extension ladders. 3. LeMay proposed a radical change in tactics that would prove devastatingly effective. Instead of high-altitude precision bombing, his B-29 seconds would attack at night from altitudes of 5,000 to 7,000 feet. This would improve accuracy, conserve fuel, and avoid the worst effects of the jet stream. Japanese night fighter defenses were weak. Anti-aircraft fire, though intense at high altitude, was less accurate at lower levels. Most controversially, LeMay ordered his bombers stripped of most defensive armament. Removing guns and gunners allowed each B-29 to carry more than twice its normal bomb load. The aircraft would fly in single file rather than formation, further improving efficiency. The bombs would be incendiaries, designed to start fires rather than destroy specific targets through explosive force. LeMay did not formally request approval for these tactics from his superiors. He briefed General Loris Norstad, Chief of Staff to General Hap Arnold, but timed his notification to arrive when Arnold would be absent. LeMay later explained that he wanted to protect Arnold from blame if the attack failed, but there was little doubt about LeMay's assessment. The new tactics would work. The only question was how devastating they would prove. The target selected for the first major incendiary raid was a 3-by-4-mile rectangle in Tokyo's Shitamachi district, including the Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa wards. These were working-class neighborhoods, home to approximately 750,000 people packed into Japan's most densely populated districts. American intelligence had correctly determined that the area contained a high concentration of small factories producing war materials. The bombs selected were primarily M69 incendiary bomblets, each weighing 6 pounds and filled with napalm. These weapons were carried in clusters. When released, each cluster broke apart at an altitude of 2,000 to 2,500 feet, scattering 38 individual bomblets. Upon striking the ground, a fuse ignited a charge that first sprayed napalm, then ignited it. The resulting fires burned at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. American engineers had tested these weapons extensively at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, where they constructed mock Japanese neighborhoods using authentic building materials and techniques. The tests demonstrated that M69 incendiaries were extraordinarily effective at starting uncontrollable fires in Japanese-style construction. The weapons had been specifically designed to exploit Japan's urban vulnerability. The first B-29 lifted off from Guam's North Field just after 5:30 on the afternoon of March 9, 1945. That first bomber was followed by more than 270 others, taking off from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian at 50-second intervals, all bound for Tokyo. Mission number 40, codenamed Operation Meeting House, was underway. Air raid sirens wailed in Tokyo around 10:30 that evening, but most inhabitants paid little attention. The city had been bombed before. Previous high-altitude raids had caused minimal damage. Most citizens had grown accustomed to air raid warnings, followed by scattered explosions and limited fires. Some people dutifully filed out of their wooden homes toward designated gathering areas. Many did not. The complacency would prove fatal. The first B-29 seconds over Tokyo were pathfinders, arriving shortly after midnight. Coming in over the target from opposite directions, These lead aircraft dropped their payloads in a massive X pattern centered on the Koto and Chuo city wards near the waterfront. The incendiaries burst into flames immediately, creating a fiery cross visible for miles. The Pathfinder's job now done, they retreated from the area, leaving the target brilliantly illuminated for the main force. Richard Bailey, a crewman with the 9th Bombardment Group, later described what he saw from his superfortress far back in the formation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. An ominous deep glow burned crimson on the horizon ahead. There was no trouble finding the target this night. It was clearly marked for all to see, burning like a funeral pyre, the flames practically licking the night sky. Bailey could almost read a paper in the cockpit due to the fires consuming Tokyo below. The main bomber force began arriving at approximately 12:08 on the morning of March 10th. Weather conditions were clear with visibility 10 miles. Surface winds blew at 45 to 67 miles per hour from the southwest. Flying at altitudes of 5,000 to 7,000 feet, well below their normal operating height, the B-29 seconds encountered surprisingly light opposition. Japanese night fighters were few and poorly coordinated. Anti-aircraft fire, though intense, proved largely ineffective against aircraft at these unexpected altitudes. One by one, at 50-second intervals, the bombers made their runs. Each aircraft carried approximately 7 tons of incendiaries. Bombardiers simply aimed near the flaming X, marking the target center. As cluster bombs fell, they broke apart, scattering bomblets across the city below. Within minutes, individual fires began coalescing into larger conflagrations. The first reports reaching Imperial Japanese Army Headquarters were fragmentary and confusing. Fires in multiple wards, communications lost with entire districts, police and fire stations not responding. As dawn approached, the true magnitude of the disaster became clear. The fires had merged into a single massive conflagration that overwhelmed every firefighting capability. Within 2 hours of the raid's commencement, rapidly spreading, flames had consumed entire neighborhoods. The high winds fanned fires from building to building with terrifying speed. Wooden structures ignited instantly. Paper walls and screens offered no resistance. Tile roofs provided no protection. The heat generated by the firestorm created its own weather, producing powerful updrafts that scattered burning debris across ever wider areas. The narrow streets of Shitamachi became death traps. Families fled their homes only to find escape routes blocked by fire on all sides. People crowded toward the Sumida River and canals, desperate to reach water. The crush of panicked humanity created deadly stampedes. Those who reached the water found it offered no refuge. The river itself seemed to boil from the heat. Bodies piled up along the banks. Some residents sought shelter in designated gathering areas, concrete schools, and temples that were supposed to offer protection. But the fires generated such intense heat that even concrete provided insufficient defense. People sheltering inside these buildings were roasted alive as temperatures exceeded those of a crematorium. Others who remained in underground shelters found themselves cooked by superheated air or suffocated when fires consumed all available oxygen. The heat was so intense that metal objects melted, glass liquefied, water in canals boiled. The fires created their own wind system, powerful enough to lift people off their feet and hurl them into flames. Witnesses reported seeing children on fire, still running, mothers with babies burning on their backs, unable to save them. Entire families joining hands before being consumed together by walls of flame. By dawn on March 10th, approximately 279 B-29 seconds had successfully delivered their payloads over Tokyo. 14 bombers never returned, lost to anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, or being caught in massive updrafts created by the fires below. 96 American airmen were killed or missing. These losses were remarkably light considering the intensity of the mission. The destruction below was almost incomprehensible. Approximately 15.8 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to ash. The Tokyo police force recorded 267,171 buildings destroyed. More than 1 million people were rendered homeless. Conservative estimates placed the death toll at 83,000. The true figure was likely much higher, approaching or exceeding 100,000 killed in a single night. The Operation Meeting House firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, constituted the single most destructive aerial bombing raid in human history. More people died in this attack than in either atomic bombing that would follow. More destruction occurred than in the firebombing of Dresden or the firebombing of Hamburg. In approximately 6 hours, American B-29 bombers had killed more Japanese civilians than had died in all previous air raids on Japan combined. Colonel Masataka Ida, receiving reports throughout that terrible night, understood the implications with cold clarity. This was not merely a disaster, this was a demonstration of capability. The Americans had proven they could destroy Japan's cities methodically, one after another, with industrial efficiency. If they could do this to Tokyo, they could do it to every urban center in Japan. The mathematics were inescapable. XXI Bomber Command possessed hundreds of B-29 seconds, with more arriving from American factories every month. Japan's cities were vulnerable, filled with flammable wooden buildings and lacking adequate civil defenses. American bomber crews had proven they could operate over Japan with relative impunity. Japanese air defenses and night fighter forces were inadequate to stop them. Ida pulled out maps of Japan's major cities: Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, Kawasaki. Each represented a concentration of population and industry. Each was built primarily of wood. Each was as vulnerable as Tokyo had proven to be. If the Americans continued this campaign, they could reduce every major Japanese city to ash within months. For the colonel, the question was no longer whether Japan could win the war. That possibility had died in the flames consuming eastern Tokyo. The question now was whether Japan's leaders would recognize reality before the entire nation was destroyed. Ida suspected the answer would come too late for hundreds of thousands more civilians who would die in the firebombing raids he knew must follow. The raids did follow, with mechanical precision that demonstrated American determination and industrial capacity in equal measure. General Curtis LeMay considered Operation Meeting House a rousing success. General Hap Arnold, commander of the United States Army Air Forces, sent a congratulatory message. "This shows your crews have the guts for anything." The firebombing of Japan would not stop with Tokyo. It would expand, intensify, become systematic. On the night of March 11th to 12th, 310 B-29 seconds struck Nagoya, Japan's third-largest city. The attack destroyed approximately 2 square miles of buildings. The bombing was spread over a greater area than at Tokyo, resulting in less concentrated damage but proving the Americans could strike multiple cities in rapid succession. On the night of March 13th to 14th, 274 superfortresses attacked Osaka, Japan's second-largest city. 8.1 square miles of urban area burned. 2 aircraft were lost. 8,000 people died, but the psychological impact far exceeded the casualty count. Japan's industrial heartland was being systematically destroyed. Kobe was next. On the night of March 16th to 17th, 331 B-29 seconds attacked the port city. The resulting firestorm destroyed 7 square miles, equivalent to half the city's area. 8,000 people were killed. 650,000 were rendered homeless. 3 B-29 seconds were lost. For Japanese authorities, the pattern was now undeniable. American bombers could strike any city, any night, with overwhelming force. On the night of March 18th to 19th, Nagoya was attacked again. The B-29 seconds destroyed nearly 3 square miles of buildings. In 9 days, from March 10th through March 18th, American bombers had burned 32 square miles in Japan's 4 largest cities. The firebombing campaign had destroyed 41% of the urban area that Allied bombers had destroyed in all of Germany during the entire European war. The cost to American forces was negligible: 22 B-29 seconds, and their crews lost in total. Then the raids paused, not from mercy or strategic reconsideration, but from a prosaic logistical reality that itself demonstrated American industrial supremacy. XXI Bomber Command had exhausted its stockpiles of incendiary bombs. The Americans had literally run out of napalm. But everyone in Japan, from the emperor to the lowliest civil defense worker, understood the pause was temporary. American factories would produce more incendiaries. The bombers would return. For Japanese military and civilian leaders, the pause provided time for devastating assessment. Post-war interrogations would reveal that many Japanese officers dated their realization of inevitable defeat to these March raids. The mathematics were inescapable. If Americans could burn 32 square miles of Japan's 4 largest cities in 9 days, they could eventually destroy every urban center in the nation. Japanese intelligence provided accurate estimates of American bomber strength. XXI Bomber Command possessed hundreds of B-29 seconds in the Marianas, with more arriving constantly from American production lines. Japan's aircraft factories, even those not yet destroyed, could not replace losses. Japan's pilot training programs could not produce crews fast enough. Japan's anti-aircraft defenses had proven inadequate. The attacks would continue until Japan surrendered or ceased to exist as a functioning nation. On March 18, 1945, 8 days after the Great Tokyo Air Raid, Emperor Hirohito conducted a personal inspection of the destroyed districts. The imperial motorcade departed the palace at 9 in the morning. The emperor, who traditionally remained sequestered within palace walls, visible to his subjects only on rare ceremonial occasions, drove through miles of devastation. The motorcade passed through Fukagawa, where Tomioka Hachiman Shrine had stood for centuries before American incendiaries reduced it to blackened stone, through Shiomi Bridge, where bodies had been pulled from canals for days after the raid, through Toyo Park, which had served as an inadequate refuge for thousands who died there, through Kinshicho, Oshiage, Komagata Bridge, and Tawaramachi, district after district of absolute destruction. What the emperor saw was comprehensive annihilation, not scattered bomb damage like the Doolittle raid had caused, not selective destruction of military targets, complete erasure of entire neighborhoods, buildings reduced to ash, infrastructure melted or burned, concrete foundations marking where tens of thousands of homes had stood. The scale of destruction was beyond anything in Japanese experience. Historians debate the effect of this tour on Emperor Hirohito. Some, like F.J. Bradley, argue the visit convinced Hirohito that Japan had lost the war. Others, including historian Richard Frank, contend the emperor supported continuing the war until mid-1945, despite witnessing Tokyo's destruction. The truth likely lies between these interpretations. The emperor understood Japan faced certain defeat, but constitutional and political realities prevented him from immediately ordering surrender. Yet the psychological impact was undeniable. The emperor had seen with his own eyes what American industrial power could accomplish. He had witnessed the helplessness of Japan's defenses. He had observed the suffering of his subjects. This personal exposure to Japan's vulnerability would influence his thinking in the critical months ahead, contributing to his eventual decision to intervene personally to end the war. For many in Japan's civilian government and military leadership, the March firebombing campaign marked the moment when strategic assumptions collapsed entirely. The concept of holding the home islands through Japanese fighting spirit confronted the reality of American material supremacy. Cities could not be defended through courage alone. Industrial production could not continue when factories burned and workers died or fled. The pause in major incendiary raids lasted through April and into May. XXI Bomber Command focused on supporting the Okinawa invasion and conducting smaller precision raids when weather permitted. But American factories worked continuously, producing more M69 incendiary bomblets, more cluster bombs, more napalm. By late May, stockpiles were replenished. The firebombing campaign would resume with even greater intensity. On the night of May 23rd to 24th, 250 B-29 seconds bombed Tokyo's Yamanote area, killing 762 people. On the night of May 25th to 26th, 464 superfortresses returned to Tokyo. This raid killed 3,352 people and destroyed 166,000 buildings. The destruction was so extensive that Tokyo Station and the Meiji-era main building of the Imperial Palace were damaged. By the end of May, Tokyo was 50% destroyed. 4 million people were homeless. Further large-scale raids were deemed unnecessary. There were insufficient targets remaining to justify the effort. The Americans moved on to systematically destroying Japan's secondary cities. Throughout June and July of 1945, the firebombing continued with industrial regularity. 62 smaller Japanese cities were targeted. LeMay's bombers began dropping leaflets before attacks, warning civilian populations that their cities would be bombed in coming days. This psychological warfare added another dimension of terror. Citizens knew destruction was coming but could do nothing to prevent it. Some cities received warnings and then were spared temporarily, while others nearby burned. The unpredictability created mass panic. Millions of civilians fled urban areas, abandoning homes and possessions, seeking safety in rural districts. This mass exodus itself disrupted war production and lowered morale throughout Japan. The statistics compiled after the war documented systematic destruction. Waves of B-29 seconds destroyed over half the total area of 66 urban centers. 178 square miles reduced to ashes. The March through July firebombing campaign killed between 300,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians. This exceeded the approximately 500,000 killed during 5 years of Allied bombing of Germany. In Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kobe, and Kawasaki, over 126,000 people were confirmed killed, and more than 1.5 million dwellings were destroyed. More than 105 square miles of urban space was eliminated. The areas leveled in these 6 cities alone exceeded the total areas destroyed in all German cities by both American and British air forces combined. American losses were comparatively light. 136 B-29 seconds were lost during the entire campaign. Considering the thousands of sorties flown and the tonnage of bombs dropped, the loss rate was remarkably low. This disparity in casualties further emphasized the complete imbalance of power between the two nations. Japanese civilian morale collapsed under the sustained bombing. Post-war surveys conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey provided detailed psychological data. In June of 1944, only 2% of the Japanese population believed they would lose the war. By December, it was 10%. By June of 1945, 46% believed defeat was inevitable. By August, 68% knew Japan had lost. When asked about reasons for surrender, more than 50% of Japanese civilians cited airstrikes as the primary cause. Some 30% blamed military losses. The bombing campaign had accomplished what years of island-hopping campaigns could not. It had brought the reality of defeat home to the Japanese people in the most direct, undeniable manner possible. 64% of the population stated in post-war surveys that they had reached a point before surrender where they felt personally unable to continue the war. Of these, less than 1/10 attributed the cause to military defeats. 1/4 attributed it to shortages of food and civilian supplies. The largest group attributed their breaking point to air attacks. The pervasiveness of the bombing's psychological impact was striking. Roughly 1/4 of all people in cities fled or were evacuated. These 8.5 million evacuees, themselves of singularly low morale, spread discouragement and disaffection throughout the rural areas where they sought refuge. The air campaign's psychological effects blanketed the entire nation, not just bombed cities. For Japanese military officers, the firebombing campaign created cognitive dissonance between doctrine and reality. Military training emphasized spirit over material, courage over industrial capacity, willingness to die over technological advantage. Yet no amount of fighting spirit could defend against hundreds of B-29 seconds, dropping thousands of tons of incendiaries. No kamikaze attack could prevent the systematic destruction of Japanese cities. General Takashima, when interrogated by the Strategic Bombing Survey after the war, stated that surrender had become unavoidable. The army, even if it successfully repelled invasion, could no longer protect the Japanese people from extermination by air attack. This acknowledgement was profound. Japan's military had lost its fundamental purpose. It could not fulfill its primary duty of protecting the nation. Other Japanese military leaders provided similar assessments in post-war interrogations. The firebombing had destroyed the psychological foundations of continued resistance. What point was there in fighting if the entire nation would be reduced to ash regardless of battlefield outcomes? What victory could be claimed if the people being defended all perished? The strategic bombing campaign had accomplished more than physical destruction. It had demonstrated absolute American control of Japanese airspace. Throughout the home islands, whose people had always thought themselves remote from attack, United States planes crisscrossed the skies with no effective Japanese air or anti-aircraft opposition. The psychological message was clear and devastating. Japan was helpless before American power. The bombing also destroyed Japan's dispersed cottage industry system. Over 50% of Tokyo's industrial production had been spread among small workshops in residential neighborhoods. These workshops produced components for larger factories. The firebombing eliminated this dispersed production capacity while simultaneously killing or displacing the workers who staffed both the small workshops and the larger factories. Japanese war production declined precipitously. Aircraft manufacturing, which had peaked at approximately 280 aircraft per month in mid-1944, fell to 150 per month by mid-1945. American production in the same period exceeded 8,000 aircraft monthly. The disparity that Japanese planners had hoped to overcome through quick victory had instead widened into an unbridgeable chasm. The naval blockade combined with strategic bombing created compound effects. American submarines had devastated Japan's merchant fleet, cutting the home islands off from resources in conquered territories. Oil from the Dutch East Indies could not be delivered. Rubber from Indochina remained overseas. Rice from Burma never arrived. Without these materials, Japanese factories could not operate even when they survived bombing. By summer of 1945, Japan faced comprehensive strategic collapse. The military could not defend against bombing. Industry could not produce war material. The merchant fleet could not deliver resources. The population was starving, demoralized, and increasingly convinced that continued resistance meant national extinction. Yet Japan's military government remained paralyzed. Army leaders, dominated by officers committed to fighting until death, refused to consider surrender. The concept of unconditional surrender was anathema to warriors raised in the Bushido tradition. Better to die with honor than live with shame. This mindset, which had produced individual acts of remarkable courage throughout the war, now prevented rational strategic assessment. Emperor Hirohito, increasingly concerned about national survival, began quietly pushing for a negotiated end to the war. In June of 1945, he told his advisers that a way to end the war must be found. But the emperor's constitutional position prevented him from ordering surrender directly. Japanese law required unanimous cabinet agreement on policy. The emperor could only ratify decisions, not make them independently. Japan's government attempted to use Soviet neutrality to negotiate a settlement. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941 had allowed both nations to focus elsewhere during the war. Japanese diplomats hoped Stalin might mediate between Japan and the Western Allies, perhaps securing terms short of unconditional surrender. This hope was delusional. Stalin had promised at the Yalta Conference in February to enter the war against Japan within 90 days of Germany's defeat. While Japanese diplomats waited for Soviet mediation that would never come, American bombers continued their systematic destruction. On July 26, the United States, Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, an ultimatum calling for Japan to surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government, still hoping for Soviet intervention, did not respond. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The weapon killed approximately 80,000 people instantly, with tens of thousands dying later from radiation effects. The psychological impact was profound, but the physical destruction was not dramatically different in scale from what conventional firebombing had already accomplished in Tokyo and other cities. On August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, Exactly 90 days after Germany's surrender, Soviet forces invaded Manchuria with overwhelming strength, crushing Japanese armies that had been stripped of resources to defend the home islands. In 1 week, Soviet forces overran positions that had taken years to construct. Japan now faced enemies on all fronts with no diplomatic escape. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 people initially. The combination of atomic bombing, Soviet invasion, and the ongoing conventional bombing campaign finally broke the deadlock in Japan's government. Emperor Hirohito, in an unprecedented intervention, personally decided that Japan must accept the Potsdam Declaration. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's recorded voice broadcast surrender to the Japanese people. It was the first time most Japanese had heard their emperor speak. His words carefully avoided the term surrender, instead announcing that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The carefully chosen phrase could not disguise the reality. Japan had been utterly defeated. The post-war accounting was stark and sobering. Total civilian casualties in Japan from 9 months of air attack, including the atomic bombs, were approximately 806,000. The vast majority died in conventional firebombing raids. Approximately 66 Japanese cities had been systematically destroyed. 178 square miles of urban area had been reduced to ash. 8.5 million people had been rendered homeless. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducting comprehensive post-war analysis, interrogated more than 700 Japanese military, government, and industrial officials. The survey's findings were unambiguous. Based on detailed investigation and testimony from surviving Japanese leaders, the survey concluded that Japan would have surrendered by the end of 1945 even without the atomic bombs, even without Soviet entry into the war, and even without a planned invasion. The key factor was the strategic bombing campaign combined with naval blockade. These had destroyed Japan's ability to wage war and had brought the reality of defeat home to both military leaders and civilian population. The atomic bombs accelerated surrender by days or weeks, but the outcome was already determined by the systematic destruction of Japan's cities and industrial capacity. For Japanese military officers interviewed after the war, the most common theme was belated recognition of American industrial supremacy. They had known the statistics before the war. They had seen intelligence reports documenting American production capacity, but they had not truly understood what those numbers meant until B-29 seconds appeared over their cities in formations of hundreds, dropping thousands of tons of incendiaries with mechanical regularity, returning night after night after night. Premier Suzuki Kantaro, who served as Prime Minister during the war's final months, stated simply, "Merely on the basis of the B-29 seconds alone, I was convinced that Japan should sue for peace." This was a remarkable admission. Not the atomic bomb, not the Soviet invasion. The sustained conventional bombing campaign had convinced Japan's Prime Minister that continuing the war was impossible. The psychological collapse was complete. Japanese officers who had believed in ultimate victory through fighting spirit, who had convinced themselves that American industrial statistics must be exaggerated, who had gambled national survival on American unwillingness to pay the price of total war, finally confronted undeniable reality. America's industrial power was not propaganda. It was material fact that determined the war's outcome as surely as if the final battles had been fought and lost in December of 1941. Colonel Masataka Ida, who had understood this truth on the morning of March 10th after the Great Tokyo air raid, spent the remaining months of war watching his predictions come true. City after city burned, casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. The civilian population's will to resist collapsed. The military's ability to protect the nation disappeared. The empire that had seemed invincible in 1942 revealed itself as helpless before American power. After the war, Ida was asked when he first knew Japan would lose. He replied simply, "March 10th, 1945, the morning after Tokyo burned." Other Japanese officers gave different dates. Some cited the fall of Saipan in July of 1944. Others mentioned the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, when Japanese naval power was finally destroyed. Still others pointed to specific bombing raids on their home cities, but the pattern was consistent. Japanese officers realized defeat was inevitable when they personally witnessed American industrial supremacy in undeniable form. For some, it was seeing endless waves of American aircraft that Japanese forces could not stop. For others, it was observing American supplies stockpiled in such abundance that material seemed unlimited. For many, it was watching their cities burn while being unable to defend them. The lesson was brutal and clear. In modern industrial warfare, production capacity determined outcomes. Japan had attacked America believing the war would be short, that American industrial power was exaggerated, that American will was weak. All three assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. America's industrial power exceeded even the highest Japanese estimates. American will proved unshakable. And the war, far from being short, lasted long enough for American production to reach full capacity and systematically destroy Japan's ability to fight. The price of this miscalculation was paid primarily by Japanese civilians. Hundreds of thousands died in bombing raids. Millions were rendered homeless. Entire cities were erased. The suffering was immense and largely avoidable. Japan's leaders had initiated a war they could not win against an enemy whose true strength they had failed to comprehend. The March 10th firebombing of Tokyo and the campaign that followed were the direct result of that strategic failure. For the United States, the firebombing campaign represented the full exploitation of industrial and technological superiority. American factories had produced the bombers. American logistics had positioned them within range of Japanese targets. American crews had delivered the weapons with devastating effectiveness. The campaign demonstrated what modern industrial warfare could accomplish when one side possessed overwhelming material advantage and the will to use it. The moral questions raised by the firebombing of Japanese cities remain debated decades later. Some argue the attacks constituted war crimes, deliberately targeting civilian populations to terrorize them into submission. Others contend the raids were militarily necessary, that destroying Japan's dispersed cottage industry required attacking residential areas where that industry was located, and that the campaign shortened the war and saved lives by avoiding invasion. These debates reflect fundamentally different ethical frameworks for evaluating warfare. What remains beyond dispute is the effectiveness of the campaign in military terms. The systematic bombing of Japanese cities destroyed war production, killed workers, rendered millions homeless, shattered morale, and convinced both military leaders and civilian population that Japan could not win. The campaign achieved its strategic objectives. The human cost was staggering. The physical destruction was comprehensive. The psychological impact was devastating. When Japanese officers said, "We cannot win," after watching B-29 seconds drop 1,665 tons of incendiaries in one Tokyo raid, they were acknowledging reality that had been written in industrial statistics before the war began. American production capacity had always been sufficient to destroy Japan. The firebombing campaign simply made that abstract truth undeniably concrete. The March 10, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo stands as the single most destructive air raid in human history. More people died that night than in either atomic bombing. More destruction occurred in 6 hours than in most sustained campaigns. The raid demonstrated American industrial supremacy and Japanese helplessness with brutal clarity. For Japanese officers witnessing the aftermath, the realization was inescapable. Japan could not win this war. America's true power had finally revealed itself in flames that consumed 16 square miles of Tokyo and 100,000 lives in a single night. The moment Colonel Ida understood on the morning of March 10th would eventually spread through Japan's entire leadership. Some resisted the conclusion longer than others. Some required additional evidence. Some clung to delusions until the very end. But ultimately, all confronted the same inescapable truth. American industrial capacity was real, overwhelming, and decisive. Japan's gamble had failed. The price of that failure was measured in hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, millions of homeless, and dozens of destroyed cities. The war that Japan could not win had continued until the nation stood on the brink of extinction. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.